Okay, well, hello everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Sean Byers and I work for Trademark Belfast. You're all very welcome to this seminar on the role of mutual banks in community wealth building. This seminar is part of a wider programme of work involving Trademark and Development Trust NI, supported by the Department for Communities, which is sort of exploring the potential for a community wealth building approach across the north of Ireland. So this work's involved in a number of different strands in a series of educational events in different localities. We've had about 60 one-to-one engagements with community organisations and representatives from different sectors of civil society. And we've had a series of public seminars on key themes related to community wealth building. So we've had one on public procurement, we've had one on financial power in local places, participatory budgeting, climate action, and the most recent one was on firm employment and just labour markets. So the purpose of our work, I suppose, is to try to generate some momentum around community wealth building at a grassroots level, while it's building an evidence base that can inform and shape how the Department for Communities and other institutions approach this agenda. So today we're here to look at the role of mutual banking in community wealth building, and we have four great speakers to talk us through different aspects of this. So before I introduce our first speaker, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to just fire them in the chat box and we'll come to them at some stage. So our first speaker is James Moore. James has 25 years experience of successful involvement in different aspects of business and finance. Today he's here speaking in his capacity as chair of the Community Savings Bank Association, which has been working to establish a network of independent local banks across the UK. And I think James has a presentation to share with us.
So thank you very much, Sean. As Sean said, my name is James Moore, and I'm here as part of the Community Savings Bank Association, which is a mutual society with really created to do one thing, and that's to help local communities build local customer-owned banks that will enrich, empower, and include those communities better than the alternatives that we have just now. So what I'd like to do is share some slides with you, and it's if you haven't looked at me as to how we go about that. Can everyone see that slide now? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So the first, how do you go about building a bank? It's quite complicated. It takes quite a lot of money and it takes quite a bit of time. But there are steps you have to go through. First of all, you need a detailed business plan. What are you going to do? Who are you going to do it for? Why are you doing it? And how is this thing going to make money and make a difference to the people? You need to design all the products and systems and branches and everything that goes with it. And you need the technology that will deliver all of those things. And the technology changes quickly. And it's an exciting bit that can enable you to do things. And you have to build it on the assumption that tomorrow is going to be different. You need to get permission. You need to get the Bank of England's permission, which is a very arduous and rightly taxing process. You need time. It takes about 18 months, 2 years if you fly through the process to get a banking license. And you need the right people who've got the right combination of the technical and business skills to run a bank, but have got the right ethical bent to want to make this bank different. And finally, you need money, you need investment. It costs about 20 million to create a community bank. That doesn't mean it costs you 20 million to build it up. You need to have 20 million because you need to have reserves with the Bank of England in case things go wrong. The first thing about these banks is that most people, when they think of banking, they think it's all about the money. We take a slightly different view, and we think it's not all about the money. So it's not about the money, then what else is it? We think for a bank to be something valuable for the community, it has to be useful and helpful, trusted and trusting, and inclusive rather than exclusive. And the way we think these banks have to be useful and helpful is they have to keep things safe. The fundamental thing about a bank is you put your money, your valuables, your information in it, it's safe. has to let you make payments, get paid, whether it's a business or individuals. And the hard part is it has to take the deposits that it has and put them to work as loans that make a difference in those communities. To be trusted and trusting, we think the bank needs to be aligned with the community it serves so that it's trying to achieve the same objectives for the same reason. When things go wrong, it has to act benevolently, not try and do you over. Not to say it has to be soft or foolish, but you have to believe that you'll be treated with respect and dignity and listened to. Find it has to be really, really competent. You know, if you're going to be a useful bank, you have to know how to be a bank. And I think the final part of being trusted and trusted is to know that you're dealing with local people who live in the community and live with the consequences of the decision those banks make. To be inclusive, you have to be accessible. You have to have branches and the internet and the mobile apps and all of these things so that different people with different needs can get access to this bank. And you have to be welcoming. Everybody has to be allowed in. It has to be something that the bank prides itself on. I think customer owned is essential for this because it gives you a level of inclusion in the bank that just being a customer doesn't give you. You're a member. You've got control. So how can we help you do that? Well, we have a thing called the bank in the box. And in that, we have everything you need to apply for a banking license. The application is about 800 pages of financial models and procedures and how you're going to run it. It's a very detailed thing. We also have the design for how you can create a low-cost bank that's got branches and the internet and apps. We've got the design of all the technology and automation that lets you do that in a way that's lower cost, lower risk, and quicker than the alternatives. We've got all the agreements for suppliers and how much they'll charge you so you can build this bank. And we've got all the interfaces that let you work with the rest of the financial system, a detailed financial model. And finally, we've got a working pilot bank. We decided we're going to convince people that these things are a good thing. We better build one. So we built a working bank in a warehouse in Vista. We were very proud of all the technology we were using until it became winter. We realized we forgot to put any heating in the damn thing. So we now know all of this stuff works at -5. Behind that, there's a huge computer network that makes all of this possible. I won't bore you with the details of this, but it's not just a pretty picture. And at the end of this, we think you'll be able to deliver a useful, trustworthy, and inclusive bank with branches and the internet and local payment system and current accounts, and accessible, that most of it's opened 24 hours a day. And the decisions that make a difference to all our lives are made by local people who are making them for the right reasons. Thank you.
Thanks, James. That was a really good overview. Not just the nuts and bolts of establishing a community bank. I like the idea of a bank in a box. Like it's obviously useful for campaigners to have that access to toolkit of, you know, how you go about and doing it, but also the social purpose of community banks is obviously key. Our next, we're going to move on to maybe some of the practical examples of what's being done around community banking. So our next speaker is on that front is Councillor Matthew Brown, whose name is sort of synonymous with what we now know as the Preston model. And he's one of the leading advocates of community wealth building across these islands. He's also a member of the Northwest Mutual, which is a community bank that's been established by Preston, Wirral and Liverpool councils. So I think Matthew's going to talk a wee bit about that and how that is located within a community wealth building agenda. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, good afternoon. Hello, everyone. Thanks for the kind invite to this event. Yeah, as has been said, obviously I'm leader of Preston City Council, and obviously I'm also tasked working for a think tank called the Democracy Collaborative to spread ideas elsewhere, really. as well as obviously implementing it at scale in Preston. I think it's very exciting where we are because just 10 years ago, the discussions around who owns the wealth in our local economy, it was not really a conversation that was taking place. And I think the economic crash of 12 or 13 years ago, which was caused by the existing financial sector and then austerity and other unexpected shocks like Brexit, I think there's a real debate now about, is the economic system that we have at the moment really working for all communities and all people? Or is it just geared to support the top 1%? So for me, I'm continually excited about the potential of what we're trying to achieve because, as I said, it really is probably a moment now where we can locally and regionally try to make an argument for a different kind of economy. And myself as an elected politician, if I don't do that, I'm letting down, in my opinion, the people I represent in Preston just because, there's still severe pockets of deprivation, life chances which are very different, life expectancy rates within my community. And it's my position and has been for some time that inequalities are the primary driving force of these these public health outcomes in many ways, both physically and psychologically as well. So as we alluded to earlier, community wealth building has 5 pillars. So that's progressive procurement, fair employment, financial power, land and assets, and democratic ownership of the economy. Obviously, with community banking, that does cover 2 of them. So it covers financial power and democratic ownership of the economy. And, it's something that I believe we've got to support as an alternative because in this country, in the United Kingdom, the banking system we do have is pretty eccentric compared to most other countries, including America, really. We just have a dominance of large investor-owned banks, which are just not normal in other communities. In terms of Preston, I think it's useful just to speak about some of the other policies that we've implemented and how community banking fits into that. So again, we traditionally had a traditional approach where we tried to focus primarily on inward investment, trying to bring in larger companies into the community. And there's a question about democracy if local government's just primarily concerned in their economic role with just trying to attract bigger businesses instead of actually making your own local economy more resilient, fairer, and more democratic. So in Preston, for over 10 years, from the late 90s until about 2011, we did work with large developers to regenerate our city centre by working with big developers to bring in large corporations. And that approach failed in 2011 when one of our anchor tenants pulled out of a big development we had. So, we really learned then that we've got to try and do things differently. We've got to try and take control in a very positive way within our community to actually bring that democracy and resilience. So we've done work around becoming a living wage employer and working with other institutions to be a living wage employer. We've worked with our big institutions to spend a lot more locally, 75 billion extra spent in our local economy with locally based companies. We've worked with our public pension fund to invest directly in our community. Public pension funds are worth, I think, 340 billion across the country. And again, it's my position that public pension funds could, if they wanted to, support banking alternatives like this. We've done other things around using public sector land to build affordable housing, worked through our planning process to get local suppliers and labour on all developments over a certain size. And then we're developing a lot of our city centre economy now in municipal ownership. So we're going to develop a cinema and other projects that will be owned by the city council. So any profits will go back to the community. We're very keen on worker and employee ownership, and then obviously we're doing other work around providing new council housing, we hope, and making sure our big institutions recruit from the less well-off areas. But, we came to the conclusion about 3 or 4 years ago that in itself, even though it is quite powerful when brought to scale, is not enough. That one of the real problems is the fact that we have a banking system which tends to extract wealth away from our community. The reality is in this country, the large banks were bailed out to the tune of £20,000, or the economy was, when we had the financial crash of 2007-8. As I said earlier, the payback for that was austerity, because if that amount of public wealth is used to bail out the economy because it's not been able to function in an efficient manner, then obviously there's a payback for that. The payback was austerity. We saw the decimation, especially of our council services, where our budget in a deprived community in the northwest of England was cut by over a third over those 10 years of austerity. So, we want to say, and we feel in the northwest, that we need to have the courage to actually create an alternative. And in addition to that, we're seeing lots of branches in some of our constituencies where the Northwest Mutual will cover, withdrawing from our high street. So obviously we're very committed in Preston with neighbouring partners to have a regional cooperative bank that will cover Lancashire, Merseyside and Cumbria. So it's estimated to be a footprint of 3 million. And again, we're getting political support for it. We're hoping to have a positive announcement in the next couple of months. And, if we are lucky, we should hopefully get it open within 18 months or so. But it's an essential part of community wealth building that we actually do have democratic banking alternatives, because the current system is really leading to issues for communities and, causing problems for local businesses accessing finance and other things. Some of the examples of how public and community banks work is really telling about the good they can do for communities. In North Dakota, you've got a publicly owned bank, which is owned by the state of North Dakota. That's been in existence for over 100 years. It devolves down to support credit unions and community banks across the state. Because it has widespread support within the state of North Dakota, 70% of banking activity is actually done through the state-owned bank. And crucially, when the economic crash of 2007-8 hit America, as it hit all of us, unemployment in North Dakota was 40% of the rest of America, who didn't have similar kind of banking arrangements. So as well as being something that I believe in philosophically, there is a real strong evidence base that that more democratic forms of banking do work extremely well. The German banking system, which obviously our cooperative bank, the Northwest Mutual Community Bank, will be based upon. I mean, Germany has a very sane way of doing banking. The majority of banking services are done by either local publicly owned banks or cooperative banks. And there's evidence as well that where cooperative banks were dense in German villages, cities and regions, when that financial crash of 2007-8 came, they avoided recession. And they're actually lending to local businesses because of the stability of having banks that are grounded in communities and owned by communities, whereas a taxpayer at the time was bailing out the much larger financial institutions. So really pleased to be here, and I'm also really delighted that there is a movement similar to ours in England and Wales, and potentially Scotland as well, in the north of Ireland, that is seeking to establish a banking alternative. I do know there's a very strong credit union movement that's here, but the advantage we have in our country, at least, is that a fully licensed cooperative bank, a community bank that we're aiming for, again, it will actually add to that democratic banking sector that we do need, really, and it will create an alternative which we can then get community support for, and will lend to local businesses, reopen branches, and really give people control over their own money and their own economic destinies, which is what community wealth building is about. So again, thanks Sean and everyone for the invite. I look forward to hearing the rest of the speakers, and I hope that was interesting, and ask myself and other panelists any questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. That was great. You continued with the thread of, well, it was a great update, but also you continued with the thread of looking at the social purpose of community banks, particularly in relation to the extractive role that the conventional banking sector has played in communities. I think there are some questions starting to flow in, but we'll come to those at the end, if that's okay. Our third speaker is Mark Hooper from Bank Cambria, which is the Welsh campaign for a community bank. My understanding is this campaign's at a pretty advanced stage, like the Northwest Mutual, and Mark's going to talk a wee bit about their journey, which has obvious implications for us here in the north, given the similarities between Wales and Northern Ireland. So I'll hand over to Mark.
Thanks, Sean, and pnawn da pawb. Good afternoon, everyone. And Wales calling, as they say. So I just wanted to give you a bit of an update as to where we are in Wales. A bit of a background to the political and social context as well, because as Matthew was talking about here, banking is quite clearly an issue of political interest to lots of people, and I can explain where we've got to there, and also give you a very up-to-date insight into what we're doing now and where we're going next, because I think we are at a point where we've progressed significantly, and I think there are some lessons for others as well, and we'd be happy to help where we can as well, to talk about how it works, how we think this is going to work for us and how it may work for other places. And I think in the north of Ireland, I think in particular, you've got, the local, you've got your local source sense of government. So it's the same as in Wales. So we've got devolved powers, and we can actually make things happen. So that's important. So just a bit of background. So we started this campaign, and I love it's being called a campaign. When Bridget first said to me, we're running the campaign for the north of Ireland, I thought that's what we've been doing. It's a campaign. This is about change. This is about campaign. I'm not a banker. I have no interest in being a banker. I was somebody who wanted to see community banking come to Wales and change the way that the economy operated. Because, if you talk about the extractive nature of the big banks, we were with somebody who had a life in corporate banking, and they explained to me that the banks try and make about £400 per person per year from an active personal current account. Now, if that figure's true, and it's made up of different ways, mostly it's about what they do with your money when it's sitting there. Those people who were closer to the centre tend to go better. So you've got communities, rural communities in particular, those who'd want to bank through the medium of Welsh, who are being completely excluded from what they do. So we have been working with James to develop our plans, and quite early on we started talking to others who are in the finance sector in Wales, particularly the mutual finance sector. So we spoke with credit unions, and we also spoke to building societies. And one of the things that we focused on was seeing whether or not, by working with a building society, we can get to market quicker. Because one of the challenges, and James referenced it in his piece as well, he talked about the work that he was doing. It reduces the costs, it reduces the risk, and it makes things go quicker. But it still doesn't stop it from being costly, risky, and it takes time. And working with a building society, it takes one of those key placeholders, one of the key problems out of the mix, which is license application. So a building society is appropriately licensed to provide all of the services that a community bank needs to do. So at the end of December last year, the Monmouthshire Building Society, which is a medium-sized building society, got about 1.3 billion under assets, announced that they were working with us to deliver Bank Cambria. So it's one of those head above the parapet moments where you've actually got an organisation who is capable of delivering this. So they are in this sector, suggesting they're going to be delivering Bank Cambria, which puts us in a position to start looking at the when now. And this is one of the key challenges. When we first started, I think a lot of people thought, is Wales capable of having its own bank? And that conversation's changed now, and it's not questions as to, why are we having a bank or should we have a bank? It's now, when will we have a bank? What will it be? Where will the branches be? And when will it happen? And that just shows that there's a real change in what we're doing. I just finished talking about the politics of this. So one of the key drivers has been Mark Drakeford, who's the First Minister of Wales, put the delivery of a community bank into his manifesto for leadership of the party, and therefore when he became First Minister, it became government policy. But over the past 18 months or so, we've worked very hard to ensure that the project enjoyed full cross-party support. So in the Senedd, 60-member Senedd, there are 4 parties represented, and all of them now support the creation of Bank Cambria and a community bank, which I think shows that politicians' postbags are filled with people saying, Why are the banks leaving our communities, and what can you do about it? So we're hopeful that once this project goes from project to reality, we will get people joining us in numbers and start to compete against some of these bigger banks, because if they don't care about Wales, our bank will, and we want to get in there soon. I'm keen to take questions. I think we've learned a lot in 18 months. I think if I was to focus where the main challenge has been, as I say, it's about belief. And once you get over the position where people believe a bank is possible, it actually changes the whole momentum. And now we're at a point where we'll be announcing progress very soon. Thanks, Sean.
Thanks a lot for that, Mark. There's a lot in that. That figure of £400 per current account is astounding. Like, I have to say that'd be hard task getting 400 quid a month or a year out of me, but that's an astounding figure. Like, and that's, as you said, that's billions coming out of our pockets and out of our communities. But I think also the issue of political will is important, and it's useful that you've highlighted that. I think that there are some questions that have come in, but again, I think we'll leave to the end. That tees us up nicely for Bridget's contribution. Bridget Meehan, who's centrally involved in the Northern Mutual Bank to establish Northern Mutual campaign to establish a community bank here in the north. So Bridget's going to talk a wee bit about what the campaign has been doing locally, where they're at, and what their plans are going forward. So take it away, Bridget. You're still on mute, Bridget.
Sorry. Thank you, Sean. I'm just going to share the screen because I can put up some slides here. So can everybody see that okay? Is that okay? So I think the other three speakers have given a good rationale for why we would want a mutual bank and the benefits that can bring to any region. And we're completely sold on the campaign here in the north. We're completely sold on that as well. So I don't need to really go through that. And what I want to give you is a kind of an overview of how we've been progressing. You've heard from Mark and how well the Welsh are doing, and that they're so far ahead in the campaign. But that's given us real hope and momentum here, because it's shown that this model is viable, and that we have an example we can point to of how well they're doing. And the other campaigns as well give us a lot of encouragement as well. So just to kind of go through what we've been doing and where we're at with it. Our campaign is just about over 2 years old. And in those 2 years or so, we've actually covered quite a lot of ground. Mostly up until recently, it's been lobbying in the background. So we've lobbied with councils and government departments and a whole lot of community and voluntary sector organisations, as well as private individuals. And some of that lobbying has started to pay off, because just in the last year, we've had council support from 2 councils. Now, this is formal support. This isn't just people saying to us, yeah, this is a great idea, well done. This is people saying, we're actually supporting your campaign. So Newry, Mourne and Down Council passed a motion in support of the campaign, and Mid and East Antrim Borough Council, just before Christmas, voted at full council to support the campaign. So that's really encouraging for us. And we're going to use that as leverage to go to the other councils now and see if they can also back the campaign. And at the moment as well, the Department for the Economy, we've talked to them, we've had some good conversations with them, and they're very interested in the project and what we're trying to achieve. So they have, we've submitted a proposal for development funding to them, and they're exploring what kind of funding pots that they would have that might be suitable for our campaign. What we've done as well is we've completed a business case that was done about a year ago, and that shows very early financial estimates that would demonstrate that this project's financially viable. So just a couple of examples out of it. Okay, we've got a population here of 1.8 million. Ideally, you'd want the population, you know, the other regions over in Britain have bigger populations, but our population, we reckon, is still just about enough for the bank to be viable. Within that, there's about 130,000 SMEs with over 4 billion SME lending, and there's 1.6 billion of a personal loan market. And we're aiming for a share of about 6% of the current accounts and 5% of the SMEs, which we believe is a modest share. But with that share, the bank will be viable. So these figures are encouraging, but as I say, they're early estimates, and we still have more financial modelling to do on that. We've also registered with the FCA as the Northern Mutual, and from that we've established a board. Myself, Tiziana O'Hara, sit on that board, as well as Bob Strong. Bob is the CEO of Advice NI, where I work, and Advice NI fully support this project, and Bob's chair of the Northern Mutual board as well. We've set up an advisory committee, that's just made up of reps from the public sector and local and central government and community and voluntary sector, and that meets quarterly or thereabouts, and just gives people an update on where we're at with things. And usually we have a speaker who will come along and talk about banking, or we've had Mark there in the past. So these are this has proven to be quite a useful committee, where we don't have any kind of formal sign up to it. People can very informally come along to the meetings that we set up, and we're getting, I think, in the last few meetings have had bigger and bigger numbers attend. So I think that's shown the interest in the campaign, and maybe that it's starting to take off a bit. The most recent piece of work that we've been working on is the publicity campaign. So as I said, up until recently, we've been really focused on backroom lobbying and talking to people individually, but now we want to go more public with the campaign. And to do that, we've set up a working group. And our last meeting was just last night. I see some of the people on the call here today are in the working group. And this is just made up of people, members of the public, who we met along the way, who expressed an interest in the bank, who thought it was a good idea. And we've just gone back to them now to say, would you like to be part of this group? And we've had a great response to that. And our first task is to, we've drafted up a pledge for MLA and MLA candidates to sign. And we're going to use that through the election and start lobbying them to see if we can get cross-party support and MLA support for the campaign. We also have a website set up with a holding page. It's basically the domain name and a home page. We haven't really developed that fully yet, but it's hopefully we will be doing that soon. And we're on Twitter as well. The handle is @Northern Mutual. So those are the kind of the main things that we've been involved in, and that is really just what I wanted to go through with people. I'll stop sharing now.
That's great, Bridget.
Okay.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that update. We've got through those 4 contributions in good time, so we have plenty of time left for a discussion. Feel free to put your hands up or to put any questions or comments in the chat. We do have a few, so I'll maybe begin with you, James, if that's okay. Paul had asked a question about the model that you had developed, and whether it's been tested anywhere beyond the pilot that you showed us. I think I saw you mentioned Wales there, that is where it's being tested. Or is it being tested anywhere else, or are there plans to do so?
I think Matthew made a good point in that this model of community-owned local banks is tested all over the world. So the basic concept is as old as banking. I think what we've done is, by building the plumbing and the wiring, is just make sure that it works. And we've been we've bravely gone second in choosing the technology. So it's all proven, it all works. And what we've done is really given people a place where they can come and customize it for themselves. So it is proven, it's all over the world. In Bista, you can come and freeze to death and play with it.
Okay, thanks for that. There are a few general, more technical questions, so it's probably best getting those out of the way before we get into more detailed sort of discussion. Like, people are asking what is the difference between a mutual bank and a building society on the one hand, and a mutual bank and a credit union on the other. So maybe, does anybody want to take that?
Shall I start off with that?
Thanks.
Building societies were originally set up to lend money to buy houses. They haven't really got into current accounts and banking. And the biggest difference between a bank and a building society is banks tend to do current accounts. That's the real difference. There's nothing to stop a building society offering those services. Most of them haven't. Some have in the past. There's some big building societies like Nationwide, where you can get a current account, but most small ones haven't. And that's because until fairly recently, it was very costly and quite complicated. It's become less complicated and a lot less costly, so it is possible. And that's the real difference. The difference between a mutual bank and a credit union is really one of scale and scope. Credit unions are limited as to how much they can do with non-personal customers. And for these banks, the small business community, both for deposits and for lending, is a vital part of the whole mix. And they also tend to want to be very, very much bigger.
Okay, thanks for that. Does anyone, anybody else want to come in on that as well? Happy enough.
Can I just to add to that in terms of building societies? I think this is an opportunity, given where the market is, for them to get back to what they were doing. They were, they're mutual organisations. They had their community. A lot of them take the name of the place that they used to be responsible for. So in Monmouthshire's case, it was the county of Monmouthshire. So that's where they started. So I think this gives them an opportunity to refocus on locality being a really important part of what they do. At the moment, you can get a mortgage from any of the building societies wherever you are in the country. So this is a really good change for them. And also, I think it probably reflects the fact that the bigger banks are in the market now for mortgages. So, with a lot of money as well. So the market for mortgages is becoming increasingly tight. So access to current account finances is really important. So I think that's probably some of the stuff that's driving, or should be driving, building societies to consider this as a real opportunity.
Bridget wants to come in there, do you, Bridget?
Yeah, I just wanted to add as well that, we get asked those questions a lot. What's the difference between what we're trying to do in a building society or a credit union? And the way I like to look at it, there are differences, and James has laid those out, but the way I like to look at it is that we have a banking system. I'm talking specifically about the banks, and that's the only option that people have. We don't have really any other choice. There are no alternatives to the private banking system. And if you want a bank account, you have to go to one of those high street banks. And what we're saying is that it doesn't actually have to be that way, because in so many places around the world, it is different. They do have alternatives. But if we want to get away from that toxic financial sector that basically was responsible for the 2008 crash and is still stronger than ever, it hasn't been diminished because of that crash. Everybody else took the hit, they didn't. If we want to start building alternatives to that and breaking that down, then models like the mutual bank those are vital, and we should see ourselves as part of the alternative financial sector, an alternative to those kind of toxic banking solutions. We should be together with building societies, mutual banks, credit unions. We shouldn't be seeing ourselves in competition with each other, but rather part of the same ecosystem. And that's really what the message I would like to get out. Banking sector is huge. The money that we're talking about is absolutely phenomenal. It's it's not like it's a small market with very little finance. It's got loads of money. There's plenty of room for other actors. There's plenty of room for a mutual bank here in the north, and plenty of room for all the credit unions here in the north. It's about how we actually work together and collaborate. I think that's going to show whether we'll make this a viable alternative.
Nice, Bridget. Matthew, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, just very briefly. Obviously, within Preston, we supported a new credit union about 8 years ago. Obviously, we got a CDFI. I think the idea of this is, we want to strengthen, the mutual sector in its entirety. And obviously, it's not trying to displace existing building societies. It's just trying to bring to scale these alternatives which are going to be beneficial for communities. So the thing which we found quite exciting about the Northwest Mutual is the fact that it's going to be at a scale that is significant across a region. We've never had regional cooperative banks in our country, but crucially the amount it's expected to lend. So it's modelled to lend about 600 million by the 8th year, which is not insignificant, and that's just on a very cautious assumption of getting 2 or 3% to either start an account or switch to the Northwest Mutual. So the idea is that obviously we will support credit unions, CDFIs and existing building societies, but we want to have this licensed alternative within a region which can potentially take on the larger banks. The credit union movement, it has expanded in the in England, but it's still very small. It's still about 2 or 3% of market share, and obviously we want to make sure that we can really expand the democratic banking sector and support credit unions as well, but have this alternative that's a bank and it's licensed. It can challenge the large financial institutions.
Thanks for that, Matthew. I'm conscious that we had a seminar a while back when we discussed some of these issues in detail. So if I can group these questions around the relationship between mutual bank and other financial institutions, I can group them together, then that might be the best idea, and then we can move on. There's a question come in prior to the seminar starting, and I suppose it's for Mark Hooper. Maybe there was a suggestion that David Smith, he was keen to understand the relationship between the community bank and the credit unions in Wales. And I understand, Mark, that you have some experience that you might be able to share in terms of that.
Yeah, I think the credit union, it's fair to say the credit union movement in Wales has seen the potential for a community bank with concern initially, because I think they have very close relationship with the Welsh government, so they were concerned about it growing as to what impact it would have. And we've been very keen to find ways to work alongside credit unions rather than work in competition. I think Bridget's point about there's room for us all in the ecosystem is clear, and actually our target and my target for this are the HSBCs, the Lloyds, the Barclays, the people who really don't care about these communities. That's the opportunity, I think. But we have worked quite closely with the biggest, or one of the biggest credit unions in Wales, and have come to conclusions as to how we might work together, particularly on sharing premises. So a lot of them have got premises in communities that they're keen to stay in, which we can help them and pay towards their rent, citing. You can see the bit of kit behind James's head, a cash recycling machine that could go into a community that can be in addition to some of the other branches that we were doing. So I think I'm really hopeful as we start to get into the operational phase that people will see that we aren't competing with credit unions, and we are focused on, as I say, the banks who stopped caring a long time ago. But it is it's an ongoing conversation. I think this is something where the dialogue has got to be consistent to get people on side.
Yeah, it's a big question, and it's, as you said, like it's an ongoing debate, and it's one that'll continue beyond this seminar. I wanted to look at something different. Maybe Pascal McCullough had asked the question for you, Matthew. Obviously, we've seen the detail of the Levelling Up agenda was published yesterday, I think. So Pascal is asking, is there any value in linking the role of a mutual bank and community wealth building with the level up agenda, or do you have any concerns around that?
I mean, it's just out this morning, isn't it? I've had a quick look at it. It's pretty uninspiring. It's not going to tackle inequalities the way that it says it's going to. It doesn't address the issues around austerity. It's like they've taken away £10 and given us back 3 or 4 with this, so it doesn't deal with that. And it also doesn't deal with things like the ownership of the economy, which is still in too few hands. So there are 1 or 2 nudges towards community wealth building within it. There's talk of a community wealth fund, which potentially could support community banks, which is going to come from dormant assets. And I think there's some reference to local investment from public pension funds, which we've been pushing for and are implemented in Preston and beyond for some time. But my own feeling with this and my instinct is that we've got to just do this ourselves. I don't think we're going to get support from government. If we do, good. But you know, my own view, and I came to that some time, is that things are that entrenched in terms of, you know, the inequalities out there, that we have to do it ourselves in many ways, try to convince other institutions within our community and businesses to support these policies, including a banking alternative. And then from that, put democratic institutions in place like community banks and cooperatives and, you know, council-owned companies and municipally owned enterprises and community land trusts and other things. Because the problem we have in our country is that we remain the most centralised in the European Union pretty much. So in terms of the resources we get, in terms of how taxation is distributed, it tends to go to central government. In terms of powers, we can't do things like we can in Berlin, where they have put, say, for example, the water into public hands. We just can't do that. It'd be unlawful. So my conclusion some time back was, you know, we've got to try and do things ourselves, really, and put alternative institutions in place. Now, this comes back to the value of a community bank. If we can make this successful, and as Bridget said, you can get 6% of the Northern Irish population into a cooperative bank, and then you get community awareness from it, then really you can like creating your own reality in communities. You know, I just don't think the government are going to help us at the scale that we need. So I think we just got to get on with it, really. I know it sounds a bit cynical, but please forgive me for that. Cheers.
Yeah, I often say when I'm speaking to people about community wealth building, we have to operate in the assumption that no one's coming to save us. Just do what we can, where we can, with what we have. Thanks for that, Matthew. Can I just follow up? I've got a quick question. If I'm going to abuse my position as chair here, like, but you spoke about the German system, public banking system. Obviously, there's a huge evidence base that's emerging from Germany and some of the other examples you mentioned, including America. I've looked a wee bit at the German system, but I don't quite understand. I know we're way off a public banking system, but I don't quite understand the relationship between community and cooperative banks there and the public banking system. Are they integrated into the system, or?
I'll do my best at answering that. I think potentially James and Mark would have greater knowledge. Just by reading about it extensively, it seems to have a mix of banks that are owned by local government, which are basically council owned, and I think some of them are indirectly supported by councils to be charities, and then you've got a number of cooperative banks within Germany. And at the end of the day, I think 55 to 60% of banking is done by those democratic forms. And that is one reason why I think the German economy has the largest number of SMEs in terms of density in Europe, because large banks don't want to lend to hairdressers and mechanics and small restaurants and other things in communities. They'd rather lend 20 million to other banks than a whole lot of £10,000 to small businesses. So, the model is really, really important. And, publicly owned banks, state-owned banks, like I mentioned, the Bank of North Dakota, they're equally as impressive. So, so in many ways, we're very poor in terms of the lack of diversity we have within our banking sector. But, these questions aren't going to go away. I mean, who caused the economic crash of 2007-8? It was obviously government's fault to a degree by deregulating the financial sector on both sides of the Atlantic. But the fact there wasn't regulation and a diverse banking sector led to that mess and led to austerity, which then led to all kinds of tensions in communities, which were there anyway already. So it's really essential that we do wake people up that there are alternatives out there, get on with it, and try to get community support for these alternatives. And this is why I'm really pleased that in the UK, some of the major unions are getting behind community wealth building, especially Communication Workers Union, because they've had ideas for a post bank and how you need to have these alternatives on the high streets, and they're looking to potentially very strongly support community wealth building in areas that are doing it. So this is a really exciting movement, as I said earlier, and these international examples are quite inspiring. And there's examples of communities where the majority of a region or a town within a region are in worker ownership. And again, in terms of the public health outcomes, life expectancy, the amount of stress and violence within a community, the mental and physical health, you find where there's more cooperatives that does improve. So there's a strong public health message around having a fairer, more democratic economy. And just finally, what have we been through in the last 2 years? The worst public health crisis since the Second World War. And what we did find is that people less well off were disproportionately affected by it, including minority communities, because they were in low-paid jobs. They were exposed to coronavirus, and it then spread, and they were disproportionately affected by it. So I think now there is a real acceptance that we have to tackle inequalities. The problem we have is politicians don't always want to do what's necessary to actually make that change, in my opinion. And to make that change, you do have to tackle quite vested interest within society. Especially those who potentially are, big corporations and others that might do damage to communities. And often that's not popular in politics because politicians are lobbied often by big businesses to do things, aren't they? So this is why I'm very excited about community wealth building and how it's spreading and how potentially we can, create an example of an alternative in place right here, right now.
Thanks for that, Matthew. Comprehensive. James or Mark, do you have anything to add to that?
I think really just to say that if you look at Germany, as everybody holds up as a classic example, cooperative banks are particularly strong in small businesses. And when I speak to my sort of German sort of friends, they laugh at me because they say, "Thanks very much. You in the UK had the first cooperative bank, and we copied you, and now you haven't got any, and we've got thousands. Thanks."
Thanks for that. Mark, do you have anything to add to that before I come back to Bridget?
No, just briefly, the talk about doing it yourself is really important. So banking is not devolved to the Welsh government. It's not devolved to the Northern Ireland government either. So but there are things you can do. You can invest in it to make it happen. So I think Matthew's point as well, the peripheries have got to start doing things themselves, and I think that's a hugely empowering thing as well. I think the evidence base, it's our opportunity to create a new evidence base for others to follow as well. So this is, it looks as though we're likely to be the first in Wales, the first community bank in the UK to get off the ground. And I think part of our job then is to help others to do the same thing. I'm very worried about the Northwest snapping at our heels, but the competitive side of me wants to make sure that doesn't happen. But I think, there is a lot of money in retail banking is somewhere where money can be made. If it's going to be made for shareholders, it'll never get back to our communities. If it's going to be held in mutuality, then it's something that we can decide what we do. And if we invest our profits in putting a bank branch so that people in Porthmadog, for example, could go and bank through the medium of Welsh by walking down the high street, then that's a worthwhile use of that money. I think it changes what you do and why you do it, which is the critical thing.
Yes.
May I ask a question? It may be a very silly question, please tell me if it is. I remember the cooperative bank, and I remember it had a leader who was totally incompetent and unqualified, and it then lost millions, or was it billions? Was that deliberate, or did it just happen?
First of all, the cooperative bank was never a cooperative. It was a limited company. And I think deliberate, I think it was a complete cock-up, any cock-up is deliberate. It was deliberate, it was avoidable, and it was regrettable. But I think it was what it was a business failure. And I don't think, if it had actually been a genuine cooperative where the members and the users could have raised their hands sooner and made a louder noise, then it was much less likely to ever appointed the numpty that was running it or see the consequences of that decision come through.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm with the cooperative bank from the sins. I think it was important, just going back to Mark's point, like the threat of a good example is really important. Like, it's where things can often snowball. We've seen that with the Preston model, and before that, Cleveland. Things snowballed, and there's something like 60 public bodies or authorities exploring community wealth building now. So with that threat of a good example, a working example that demonstrates the benefits, it can have a really positive effect. There's a really interesting discussion going on in the chat here, but I wanted to come back to Bridget on a couple of points. I suppose we've been talking about what's necessary to make this happen. And Andrew McMurray, I think, has asked, what is the ask, I suppose, from the Northern Mutual? What was the ask of politicians and policymakers? Is it beyond the financial commitment, or is that the key sort of linchpin to getting the bank off the ground?
Yeah, I've answered it slightly in the chat, but I think it's good to get the chance here now to answer to everybody. The ask is financial, and it's also in kind as well. We need to see how, I suppose we need the will to be there for this to happen. So like in Wales, where the government said, we actually want this to happen in our country, we need to say the same for the state. So it would be really good for us to be able to get governmental support for that. Going back to Matthew's thing about trying to do things ourselves, and you said yourself, Sean, not waiting for somebody to come over the horizon to save you. We need to be doing things ourselves on the ground. And I find that people working at the grassroots are so proactive and are just getting on with things, while government usually lags well behind. But at the same time, something like a bank, which is going to be regionally based, can benefit from governmental support. So we would like support from the Assembly, and this is why our publicity working group is going to be putting out that pledge to get MLAs to sign up and support it. That's them saying, we commit to this project, we want to see it happen. So that's kind of the first step that they need to take. Then the next step has to be about the finances. There's in Wales, the kind of the models to each of I think the regions in England who have campaigns are doing the fundraising slightly differently. So there's kind of a development money that needs to be found, and then there's also capitalization for the bank itself. And there's various ways that can be found. So you can have private individuals who want to become a member of the bank, and they can invest. So that would be an investment that they would get a return on. And then you can have public institutions, the anchor institutions that say, well, we've got money as well, we can invest in it, and they get a return on that. So that's, we would like kind of financial commitments like that. And the Assembly being able to actually put some money towards it as well would be hugely helpful, not even just for the money itself, but for what that would demonstrate. That would show everybody that they're actually behind it and they believe in it, just the way, which is what happened in Wales. But we're looking at maybe 20 million, that's kind of the tag that's put on it. Some people maybe say it's closer to 25, but still, although that's a substantial sum of money, that is not a huge unattainable sum of money. James always used the example of 20 million being this equivalent to building 1.5 mile dual carriageway. So put in that perspective, it's really, small change. We spent, DFC in 2020 spent 304 million on just dealing with the pandemic. 304 million from one department dealing on one issue. So that's the kind of money government can spend. And then the high street voucher there, that scheme just before Christmas, 140 million. They're quite bigger, they're more substantial sums of money. So when you look at it that way, a lot of these, the spend there has very little legacy. There's very little to show for it now. It maybe got people through a crisis moment, but it's certainly not doing anything for them at this point. If you put the 20 million into a bank, that is going to have a very long-term reach. It's going to have a legacy. It's going to potentially transform the region. So that's what we're sort of, that's how we're presenting it to government when we talk to any officials about the support we would want from them. But initially, the first support is actually for them to come out and say, yes, we believe that this is a project that can work and we want to get behind it.
Thanks for that, Bridget. Tatiana, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I thought that Andrew's question was very interesting, but also to add to what Bridget said, that we wanted the support of the third sector, of the civic society. So in some sort of way, we found that was very, very useful for us to have Advise and I supporting the campaign, for instance, with the involvement of Bob. In the same way, we are looking at the involvement of many other third sector society, maybe a change in attitude, a shift in mentality of our funders, local funders, so that they can actually start to invest in those kind of initiatives that really brings a systematic change to the region. So the ask is more than government. The ask is also to civic society, to the community voluntary sector. And I know Andrew very well, that as a developer of cooperatives is being very much, into it, but it's really asked to believe, like Mark said, in this idea and start to shift the way we are doing things in Northern Ireland. And it's a bigger ask that is not only addressed to government. As I said, Advise and I came on board and made a difference because they wanted to solve a bigger problem like poverty, like exclusion, by doing something systematically different. And that's what we ask. Thank you.
Just to follow up, like what can people from the third sector do to support you or get involved?
Again, pledge publicly what they can do, work within their own organization, and maybe try to put some kind of investment into this idea. We ask funders, local funders, to look at their funding programs and shift their funding programs into looking at what a financial change or financial kind of systematic change will look like, what kind of support they look for. And of course, join also a public campaign. Sometimes it's very difficult to persuade the people to say it loud and clear. Well, not for everybody, but certainly it's important that the people start to say it loud and clear that we want something a bit more than what we have.
And Mary is sort of added there about third sector organisations and make a commitment to bank with a community bank if and when it's established. I suppose that's leads on to a question I wanted to ask Mark, and people have raised it. Mark, what sort of commitment did the Welsh Government provide for the mutual bank, like financially and otherwise? And just along the lines of what Bridget and Tatiana have been saying, what sort of involvement is there in terms of the third sector in Wales, the community organisations?
So I'll break that down. So the first thing I think to pick up on is that the political support is really, really important. So I think that however you go and do it, I would make sure that the campaign focuses on getting that lobbying working well, is effective, and gets people on board, because then that releases funds, releases support. But so far we've only had we've spent £165,000 of grant money to get us to this point, to get us to a point where Monmouthshire have taken it on. So comparatively, again, that's not a big amount of money to get us to where we are. The investment is likely to be, the capital investment we've spoken about. Is it going to be in the region of £20 million? It's interesting, Matthew was talking about the pension schemes, because we've also been, our investment is likely to be Welsh Government plus hopefully the local government pension schemes in Wales. And this again is relatively small fry for them. They find this money down the back of a sofa. This is very, very doable for an investment. The investment, when it comes, will be on commercial terms, so it will actually be something that pays back to the state. And in our case, we've got a building society that's been around with revenue, they understand their revenue base, been around for 152 years. An investment at £20 million by whoever does it is actually a relatively secure investment, which again suits pension schemes. But one of the things I think we've managed to do as well, and this is something I referenced just slightly, is we've also been talking to it at a wider scale as well, not just third sector, but people. So we've gone to communities and talked to real people about what the impact of bank branches going in some of those communities. I know social media is not everything, but we've got lots of followers on Twitter. When we put a message out, it goes a long way. We've capitalized on the fact, I don't know who referenced earlier, talked about what we've just been through with this COVID pandemic in Wales. We've actually had a situation where the Welsh government is being clearly different to the UK government. So people have started to question the need for more national institutions in Wales, which is a great opportunity for us to be able to talk into that space. There is a sense now that people are reflecting more on the local communities that they're part of and engaging in it. And this is a space that opportunity doesn't last forever. This is a time where we've got to have those conversations and say, if you're fed up, I don't know whether you've got Wetherspoons pubs over in the north, but the amount of people who will not go into Wetherspoons again after the way they treated staff at the start of the pandemic. Those are choices that people need to make in relation to banks. The banks are continuing to leave our communities day in, day out. We can offer an alternative, but we almost need, we need to get that bulk of support behind us. And I feel like we're at a point now, we're not there yet, but we're at a point where there's almost a tipping point. People believe it's going to happen, and then it's moving forward. Just lastly, third sector organisation. We started from within the Wales Cooperative Centre. So that's a development agency for cooperatives in Wales. So we were embedded within that third sector as a starting point. That's where we've emerged. So we have good contacts in those areas and have continued to nurture them. But, people, we want the public to say, demand this. As soon as they do that, politicians listen. And that's the critical thing. Make it something that people really demand.
Yeah.
I used to be in Germany. I remember the Raiffeisen Bank was a bank just for agricultural communities, I think. But here in Lisbon and Northern Ireland, as you know, there's a lot of protest about what has happened. And it seems to me that, as I heard earlier, it's people down the lower end of the economic scale who are desperate for some financial support, and they are not going to get it from mainstream banks. And I think the people like me, well retired, with a pension and things, I think a lot of people like me are quite eager that we should start local community banking, to not as a charity, but to give people who really don't have any financial clout a chance to become financially more viable. And I think a lot of people like me, who could be quite complacent, sitting doing nothing, would be very eager to support it. Our protest group in Lisbon, for instance, We have one man there who's a wonderful agriculturalist, and his ideas about modern, not farming, but how to produce food are incredible. And to find that a bank system like this would support that locally, I think would be fantastic.
There you go, Bridget, voice of support. Do you want to respond to that, Bridget?
Yeah, because I think the point Clive has made is really relevant, and it's something that I would have seen, my vision for what this bank will be able to achieve here. That's the kind of thing I see it being able to do, stepping into that space that basically the mainstream banks just don't care about. That's not what they're interested in. I got interested in setting up a mutual bank, not because I have any banking background or I even like banks or anything like that, but it just made so much sense to me that being able to have control of your own money, democratizing your money in a sense, that was the only way that you were going to have be able to kind of make your own decisions about what you wanted to do in the region. And I sort of have an idea of, like, when you look at the Mondragon model, that really inspired me. They have a bank at the heart of that. So they're the biggest cooperative movement in the world. And while it's, it's not perfect and they have various issues, but the key to them growing to that size and being so powerful in that region and being of such benefit to that region was the fact that they had their own bank. So they controlled their own money, and they didn't have much. They weren't getting much from anywhere else. They did that from within. So that inspired me, and I thought, this is actually what we need. And I was looking at that and then happened to find the CSBA website. And that's when I actually found, so I came at it from that perspective that Clyde's talking about. How do we start growing the industries here, the small businesses here, the co-ops here? How do we start growing them and, make more of our own resources? I mean, there's no reason why we couldn't be providing all of our own energy needs here through renewable sources. We have the best wind power, wind energy and wave energy resources in the whole of Europe. And yet in all, we're importing 87% of our energy, and it's all fossil fuels. So there's a climate and environmental issue here, and there's also a resilience and independence issue here. But nobody, the mainstream banks aren't interested in investing in a region for those kind of reasons. They're not interested in that. They're interested in making profits for their shareholders. And they're interested in you as a customer because you're going to be a source of money for them. And if you're not going to be much of a source of money, they're probably not even that interested in you either. So this mutual says, turn it on its head, because the member is first. That's who we answer to, and their needs come first, and then using that money for the actual region and to do things like what Clive mentioned, to get into that more cooperative food, energy, all of that, and a slew of other sectors. And that's all there to be done, but we can't do it because we can't get access to the money that we have.
Thanks, Bridget. There's something that you hit on there in terms of the climate crisis, and I suppose that speaks to an issue that Damien McElroy had raised. He wanted to ask for people's view on banking in the climate crisis and whether democratic banking and finance is essential to delivering a low carbon or zero carbon transition. Like, so you've spoken a wee bit about it, Bridget. I wonder if it'd come to Matthew, because if I understand correctly, there's a sustainability sort of aspect to the Northwest Mutual's proposed mandate. Is that right? Or have I got that wrong?
It is, obviously, the nuts and bolts answer to that question is probably a bit better coming from James. But yes, I mean, there is an issue, I think, around investments in all our financial institutions and where they've been and whether they are helping us move towards net zero by 2030, hopefully. Obviously, the pension funds, as we know, have heavily invested in fossil fuels. I presume the large banks have done that as well. What I do know from conversations with James is that the Northwest Mutual and I believe the Bank Cambria and others of these regional cooperative banks, community banks, they will be looking to tackle that and looking to lend, as part of their investments, they'll make sure that it does actually support a green economy and potentially a local Green New Deal. So yeah, I think James will probably know a few more details, but I think there's the reality that a bank is customer owned, community owned by the community. I think it makes things around kind of like morality in how banking is done a lot easier, because obviously you know who the shareholders are, you know where they are. They have a democracy in the fact it's their bank and they can actually keep an oversight of these things. Whereas if it's a large corporate bank, it's often difficult to know who the investors are and who's making the decisions. So I think by the fact they are rooted in place and democratically owned and regionally owned, I think that will help tackle the climate crisis as well. Cheers.
Cheers, Matthew. James, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think one of the key things is that whether it's the issues that Clive raised or the sort of green economy, is the people who will be making the decisions on what this bank does live with you, and they have to be elected by you and approved by you to run this bank. So whether it's a global issue like climate change, which affects us all, or a local issue that you want to address, you have the power and the influence to actually tune this bank to yourself. And I think that's why it's important that we haven't tried to open a cooperative bank for the whole of the UK. We want to open them in each region, because what you need and what you want is different and will change differently. And you shouldn't have to compromise because someone in Scotland is. And you have the power and the authority to make this bank respond to you. And I think, as Matthew said, that's the best way of making sure that its morals stay on the straight and narrow. And if it isn't, it's your fault, because you've got the chance to change it. And it's important that you exercise that as well as you have that in theory. But I think it's the best way to make these banks responsive and moral.
Nice thought, James. Mark, I just wonder whether you've you could shed any light on the Welsh experience when it comes to climate action. Whether is there a sustainability mandate built into your proposals, or is there a way of, what are your thoughts in terms of how your bank can address climate action in your localities?
I'm going to just completely endorse what James said. So it's about but people need to get engaged and exercise their votes. If people who are members of building societies and other mutuals at the moment don't, especially financial mutuals, tend not to get involved in the decision-making process. I think what we're probably going to bring is a very active cohort, which will probably surprise the building society, who are engaged, who will have a view on it. So I think that's the route through, because I think so the government, as part of their investment, there will be sustainability parts to the investment that comes through, but I think it's going to be more for the long term. You've actually just got to have engaged cohort of members, and that ensures that we all follow the same route, one would hope.
Could I just say that I read a lot, and it does seem that corporations and banks and various military organizations have subsumed an awful lot of public wealth, or wealth that should be public. And it seems to me that this idea, which you all, thank goodness, are promoting and hope comes to reality in Northern Ireland, is a way to make sure that whatever wealth there is and monies that there are is kept in people's local hands, because it really is disappearing into some hugely rich, awful places. And for that reason alone, I would support this.
Thanks, Clive. Yeah, well, that's the democratic element of it, isn't it? Democratizing ownership and control over society's wealth. That's exactly what we're talking about. I think we're going to bring things to a close on that point. There's one more. Bridget, you've sort of answered this in the chat, but I think it'd be worthwhile addressing it here. Someone has asked about the role of mutual community banks in addressing helping people who have lost access to banking services. whether in rural communities or they're elderly and don't have access to the internet and so on. So you maybe address that question, and then we'll look to bring things to a close.
Okay. That's something that is, James even mentioned in his presentation about the bank being inclusive. What that meant was, if you live here, if you're connected to this region, you'll be able to open a bank account. So nobody can be refused a bank account. We do have a problem with people, I think it's about 10% of the population that are unbanked. And when you're unbanked, when you can't do transactions through a bank account, you get hit with a poverty premium. And that can be £400 or £500 a year extra that people pay. But the people who are paying that are always the ones who have the least. Somebody who's on a good income will have a bank account, but it's usually the people who earn the least who can't, for whatever reason, can't access a bank account, or the credit rating is so poor and they can't actually now open a bank account, and those people are hit even further with costs. There's also the mutual will aim that the fact that somebody will not be able to get access to a bank account. With the mutual, they will be able to get a bank account, and it'll be able to do everything. It won't be some basic bank account that just gives them a bare minimum of services. It'll be what everybody else gets, a full functioning current account. The other thing about inclusion is the fact that we are seeing branch closures. We've been hemorrhaging branches for the last number of years, hemorrhaging ATMs, and especially in rural areas, and especially in the most disadvantaged areas, kind of the places where they're needed most. But I think that's a perversity of capitalism in general, but of the banking service. The bank never wants to give you money when you need it. They only give you money when you've got money. It's the very opposite. It's always the opposite of what you need from a bank. So they're taking away these services because they're saying that it's too expensive for them to keep branches open. Well, they're not actually saying it's too expensive for them to keep it open. They're saying that they're not getting enough customers coming through the banks and the branches, and that people don't want to bank in that way anymore. I disagree. I think we all want to have online and mobile services, but we also want to know we can go to a branch and we can talk to a human being, or if we ring them, that we're not put through to a call center in Dublin or Belfast, that we're actually talking to somebody that's in the local branch who may even have got to know us over time. So it's about bringing that inclusion as well, bringing branches back into the high streets, back into communities. And we can do that because we're not profit driven. So we're not interested in cutting corners any way we can to try and keep branch costs down. So we've got that advantage over high street banks, but also because we can have automated branches, that bank pod that you see behind James, that could easily go into the back of an existing building. We talked about co-location. You see post offices at the back of a shop. We could have arrangements like that made with community groups or other community facilities, have a secure area where people can go and do, and that pod will give them all the services they need. It also has a video link up so they can talk to a member of staff. That's going to vastly reduce costs when it comes to delivering banking services into communities. So we'll be able to do that, and it'll be a priority for us, because priority is not about making profit. It's about serving the needs of the members and the region.
Sean, I know you're wanting to stop, but you just reminded me of something. 40 years ago, my brother-in-law in Malaysia used to run the Employee Provident Fund. Many poor people in Malaysia, and the poorest of the poor, they would pay in 10 ringgit perhaps a month or a week or whatever. And according to that 10 ringgit they paid in, they could withdraw, should we say, 100 ringgit to sort out their week or whatever. And it was a constant source and a constant availability to the very poor. So the Employee Provident Fund, I always admired it, I must say, and it was very compassionate and useful.
Thanks, Clive. Thanks again. And thanks for that answer, Bridget. Very Sarah. There's a really interesting discussion going on in the chat, and there's lots more questions and issues that we could address. We could be here all day, but I think an hour and a half is plenty. So on that note, I think we'll look to finish. Look, thanks to the 4 speakers, first of all, for their contributions. I mean, I learned a lot. I'm still learning the ropes when it comes to mutual banking and its role in community wealth building. So I've learned a lot, and I'll certainly be keeping a close eye on the 3 respective campaigns. Thanks to everyone who's attended and asked a question, made a comment, made a contribution at all, and for sticking with us for the hour and a half. If anybody wants to follow or track the Northern Mutual campaign, they have a Twitter account, isn't that right, Bridget? And at Northern Mutual, is that right? So
yeah, at Northern Mutual, yeah.
Yeah, you can follow that. We're planning another 2 seminars as part of this series, looking at different aspects of community wealth building. We're looking at plural ownership and community housing potentially, so keep an eye out for those. But until then, can I just ask you to thank our speakers and look out for the recording, and have a great day.